Welcome to the Standing for Truth YouTube channel, where we make the Bible come alive. Make sure to follow us for the best evidence refuting evolution and confirming biblical creation.
Hey, Standing for Truth members. This is Matt. Just wanted to thank everyone for being members. You're getting early access to a video. Just the other day, we had a hydroplate theory presentation. We had a bunch of people on the panel, and of course, too many questions came in for us to answer. So I guess I'll be doing that today for them and for everybody. And we're going to jump right into that now. One of the questions was, is there any kind of evidence that the mid-oceanic ridge was ever above sea level? And the answer to that is yes. Matter of fact, we have legends from around the world about people talking about seeing land from where they lived out in the ocean that is now gone. Many myths and legends, from the Hopi mythology to the legends of Atlantis. And if you look on the maps at where these legends take place, the description is right where the mid-Atlantic ridge and oceanic ridges are around the world. So the next one would be, what should we expect to see, according to hydroplate theory, if granite plates impacted one another, and what would that evidence look like? Well, asking AI exactly what that would look like if there was soft or wet granite, like partially molten or highly ductile under pressure, it wouldn't just pile up like dirt. It would deform plastically. Basically, it would look like a soft, wet plastic band forming. And that's exactly what it looks like and what we see when we look at mountains today made of granite. Here's another one. This is Elliott's Peak. Oh, kind of smaller. Elliott Peak Mountain at Ernest Ross. I'm not exactly sure what that is. I've never visited, but the pictures are worth 1,000 words. Oh, yes, and now I'm in the way. Hold on. Okay, next question. Why would the mid-Atlantic ridge open up rather than in a single spot? Why would it burst along a fashion of the mid-Atlantic ridge and not just through one or several openings through the upper granite crust, as one would expect? For example, if you heat a bottle of water, the bottle will rupture and burst in the one weak spot, not evenly along a line. And that is actually answered based on the shape of a water bottle. You wouldn't expect a water bottle to break along a line simply because as water heats and turns into steam, it expands, causing pressure to build up isotropically, which means uniformly in all directions. So when the Earth's crust collapsed and it broke down, and the mountain was doing this, compressing down onto the water, the fountains of the great deep erupted first at the structural weak point. And so it did come out of one area first. Remember, Walt Brown said as it broke through, it took about 2 to 3 hours to encompass the entire Earth. And the reason it did is because of the escape pressure was trying to escape in every direction. So Dr. Walt Brown stated that the rupture began at a weak point spot and then propagated around the globe, completing a full circuit in approximately 2 to 3 hours. So the next one, during the fountains of the great deep breaking open, would it be harder for water and rocks to reach escape velocity? That's a good question. And they've done calculations, Walt Brown did, especially regarding, like, he said Mach 150 is what it was. And if we look at that, the math has been run. So we see an escape velocity of 11,200 miles per second. And yes, that's 4.5 times faster than the required needed escape velocity to occur. And so the next one would be, which one would be able to do it better? Water, can water leave the atmosphere? Can steam and vapor leave? And can small rock fragments and large rock fragments? And everything was able to leave the atmosphere. Here's a chart of the required velocity for each of those elements to leave. And I asked the question that the person wanted to know: could water leave easier or rocks? And surprisingly, water is easier to move and eject, but harder to concentrate into a focused launch. So it would have to be in these steam jets that jettisoned up during when the 60 miles of granite came down and compressed the water that was underneath it in those areas. The other areas might not be strong enough, but that's what formed the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, clearly very strong. And then we would also want to know how much water would have to be in the atmosphere by each of these jets one at a time. Because once the jets go out in that area to wrap around the entire world, of all the jets are going off at the same time, how much water would be required to not heat the temperature of the atmosphere too much? And there's your numbers for that. And the total amount of size of the amount of water that is, for us to know in a layman's terms, would be the size of California and Texas covered in 1 mile deep of water. So massive amounts of water. Kent Hovind had another theory, and his theory is that, you can see it right here, a comet made an impact and ejected the material, a lot of it, from the Earth into space in a localized region. And the torrential rain actually came from the comet itself. So I did some digging and I made a video for you guys. I will play it because I actually did find some pretty intriguing evidence for what he's talking about.
Sir Isaac Newton saw the first comet in the sky observed by telescope. He used the Great Comet of 1680 to calculate its trajectory to determine if his theory on gravitation was true or not. His calculations were so precise, they not only confirmed his universal theory of gravitation, but the astronomer, geophysicist, mathematician, and meteorologist Edmund Halley, who also studied comets, used Newton's equation to help him determine the orbits of 24 other comets and predict where they would appear in the night sky. They all lined up perfectly. But now it gets really interesting. Later came Johann Franz Encke's, which the comet of 1786 is named after. He calculated the trajectory of this comet using Edmund Halley's prior calculations going back in time, when he noticed something strange around 5,000 years ago for this comet. The numbers show its orbit was not the same as it is now. Something drastic must have happened. Writing in Frontiers, the magazine of particle physics and astronomy research, Dr. Bill Napier, an astronomer at Armagh Observatory, and Dr. Victor Klube from Oxford, says that all the evidence points to a comet hitting the Earth 5,000 years ago. They suggest that it was this comet that we can still observe passing Earth every 3.3 years. And what we observe is actually just a remnant, along with its associated stream of meteors, of the original comet. And it was this original piece of the comet, a larger fragment that was shed, which struck Earth and caused the Great Flood of Noah's Day. The impact location of the strike is Burkle Crater, located in the Indian Ocean. Regarding the impact site, scientists say, This giant mother comet is thought to have started disintegrating as recently as 5,000 years ago. They even describe the event after the impact with amazing mental visuals. They state, at this time, and for some millennia afterwards, the night sky would have been lit up by a bright light caused by dust particles, comet fragments, and firework displays of meteor storms. The comet passing over the Earth and impacting is what caused the Earth to crack like an egg, dropping the continental shelf and causing the fountains of the great deep to break forth. The waves of the tsunami bombarding the newly formed continents and eventually burying all life. And the water from the comet's tail saturated the upper atmosphere, causing torrential rainfall for 40 days and nights. According to the book of Genesis, in the 600th day of Noah's life, in the second month, in the 17th day of the month, that same day where the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. William Winston, who succeeded Isaac Newton as professor at Cambridge, stated that a comet passing close or impacting Earth explains these phenomenon perfectly. The vaporous tail of the comet saturated the upper atmosphere with excess water, which led to a cataclysmic rainfall. The gravitational pull of the comet, he said, is what fractured the planet's crust. And now we have physical, historical, and mathematical evidence to prove it.
So how crazy is that? The very location where Walt Brown pointed to on a map saying that the global flood started, the crack in the ocean, is exactly where this comet hit. Right there. That is where Walt Brown said that this fault began during Noah's flood, and that's exactly where this comet impacted Earth. I mean, the coincidences are just unbelievable. The statistical probability of that alone is for Kent to have randomly guessed. So I find that very amazing. Okay, next one. Here's probably the most important question of all. So pay close attention, because liquefaction is what Walt Brown said played a major factor in Noah's flood, creating the layers of sediments that we see. So would liquefaction mix sediments or separate them? And Walt Brown's book is silent on this. It's actually not. On page 197, it starts, it literally has like 10 pages on this. We'll get into that in a minute, though. There is thick and widespread salt deposits in the Gulf of Mexico. How does salt fit into the hydroplate model? So first, we need to explain what liquefaction is real quick. It's a phenomenon where the soil loses its strength and begins to act like a liquid, often seen during earthquakes. So as you can see in this image, look at the water underneath here. During an earthquake, you can see that everything starts to bubble up right here. And that's what causes the houses to sink down in it, because the solid ground becomes more liquid and things sink into it. So liquefaction, when you ask and try to find out what it does do, does it separate or does it mix? It says there is separation, not mixing. That's the answer to his first part of the question. It's a separation, not a mixing of materials. So it would create layers. Another one, this is directly from page 199 of his book. I wanted to know how often liquefaction is actually occurring in his model. I found half the time during the flood phase, water was pushed down into the sediments stored for the others discharge half cycle, in which the water flowed upward. Okay, so now we know. there is half the time during the flood, liquefaction is happening. That's really important for us to know because we want to know what these phases in the flood are. So I made a brief list right here. So in the case of the global flood, there was an initial burst of water geysers that shot up and out of the ground. Big waves followed that because obviously debris is going to be falling back to Earth, and there's earthquake going on everywhere. So liquefaction is the first process that's occurring. Then over the following months, there's a slow rise of water coming out of the fountains of the great deep, followed by fast-moving currents that are moving from left to right and up and down. So that is the most important thing. The next, what would our fossil layer look like? I can throw myself on screen if you care. Probably not, but there you go. This one is what I wanted to show everybody because a lot of people think there was only one flood. That's kind of missing the bigger picture. There's been floods in the past. So pre-floods, we have to assume there were tsunamis. I mean, there were meteor impacts. So we have to have some form of tsunamis that were before there was ever a global flood because we find them in the geologic layers that are pre-flood. Then we find a global flood, massive amounts of layers. And then we find a post-flood ice age. And now, how could we know what these are? So here's a map, obviously, of the United States. So you can see what a pre-flood would have looked like and why we think this. So this was a pre-flood flood, most likely a meteor impact. And the reason I say that is because I don't think it would be a tsunami that would come from an earthquake because the continents were still all connected. And there wouldn't have been thermal subduction causing such turmoil. We can actually find that in zircon crystals because the earliest ones don't show any magnetism change, which means there was no plate tectonic movement occurring. So I would believe that this would come from meteor impact in this area. So what do we see? The perimeters explain the earliest flood layers because all of it is aquatic life. And here's a picture of what that would look like. North America, the Florida area, all gone, wiped out. Here's the Morrison Formation, just highlighted. I thought you guys would like the visuals to that. And this is what wiped out all of the trilobites. This is why we find them on this perimeter-like region. And the proof for that would be that we find fossilized tracks of these trilobites moving up through the geologic column as they're trying to save themselves from the floodwaters, bringing in different muddy sediments. And they walked through and then they died in the upper layer. To me, that is my favorite proof, but it also applies to tracks of all animals because the next flood to come is the global flood of Noah. And it also shows this exact same scenario where we find the tracks long before we find the bodies in the geologic record. That's proof that the ages are mythical and that the flood occurred. And another good one would be that 97% of all fossils are scrambled up and not complete. They are disarticulated, right? And then 3% are completed, like they're full skeletons. That's very, very few. And then how would we explain this habitat? Well, here would be the Jurassic layer going directly to Noah's flood now. This is not a pre-flood map. This would be one of the first layers that would have been buried during the flood. And we find it in the lowland area. And the water would have poured through the continent in that region, and that's why it looks like that. The next layer would be as the water spread out, the early Cretaceous layer. And we can see them now, more fossils in more areas as the water, again, went through. And then we find the middle Cretaceous area as they started to condense, as the flood water pushed them all together down into the pockets. We find the ferocious dinosaurs there. We find no trilobites, so it wasn't near where they lived at the time because they were already gone. And we find no humans anywhere because obviously they didn't live in the area. I place humans up in this region of the world, and this is the United States down over here. So there's a reason humans would have not made this migration pattern in 2,000 years. Remember, people migrated to the east. So that's moving this direction. They're not going this really. I mean, they could, but it wouldn't make much sense that Noah would have been able to preach to the world of people if they're all the way down here and he's up here making an ark. Just my 2 cents. Here we go. Here's another picture of that land mass as the flood came in. Here you can see Florida completely gone, submerged away as the water moved up and rippled away. And then we get to the middle Cretaceous. Here we see the fossils again have gone over through California, and then the Morrison Formation through the middle of the states right here. And if we take this map that I showed you just a moment ago, this one, and we do an overlay of this, what does it look like? You'll find it fits perfectly with what we would expect to find on these fossils being in a flood. Now we're in the late Cretaceous. We can see that the fossils have now shifted and they're moving down to the Gulf of Mexico, which is now the Gulf of America. And then we got California over here. They shifted towards the down even more. And then, of course, in the Morrison area formation, they've moved more centralized. They've condensed. And then the final picture is where all of the fossils have now shifted to the coastlines, except for, of course, in the Morrison Formation area where the flood already pushed everything down. So this is beyond obvious that a flood occurred and that we explain the fossil record so much better looking at it from a flood perspective. I mean, just look at the sand runoff in this Gulf of Mexico going down 1,500 feet. It's insane. But let's not forget that other part. Where does salt fit into this hydroplate theory model? Okay, well, if we look up here at this map, what you'll notice is the black lines right here, that's salt, but they don't arise until the Pliocene era. Well, as young Earth creationists, we can view different layers as different epochs of the flood happening rather than time. So it wasn't from Noah's flood, although salt could have come out during Noah's flood. There's no problem with that. The subterranean layers could have had tons of salt in them. But when did they get to this area? It was from the Ice Age melt-off that rushed it in from the north. Next one, look at this. Remember, Darwin predicted slow Darwinian gradualism and nothing else in the fossil record, because when slow eons of time pass, you get a gradual intermediaries up until modern times. What did we find instead? Everything else except for that. We have disharmonious associations. That's where we find warm climate species mixed with cold ice age species. We find ghost lineages where creatures arrive out of nowhere. We have de-evolution where it goes backwards in time. We have stasis where things don't change really much at all over supposedly hundreds of millions of years. Then we have Lazarus taxons where something's alive and then it disappears for millions of years and then arises back completely unchanged later in the fossil record again. And then convergent evolution, that's a good one. Punctuated equilibrium, where it doesn't move at all and then makes huge leaps super fast in time. I mean, we only needed to find one of those things to falsify it. And remember, Darwin said right here, no organism wholly soft can even be preserved. That's because he thinks that it took tens of thousands of years to fossilize something. It doesn't. It's not time. It's process. Instead of finding the slow, smooth, and progressive change Lyell and Darwin had expected, they saw in the fossil record rapid bursts of change, new species appearing seamlessly out of nowhere and then remaining unchanged for millions of years. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as a trade secret among paleontology. Why is that? Because it's not true and it would destroy their narrative. And think about this. Humans have seen things that have supposedly should have never seen. Here's a cave art drawing of something that went extinct 280 million years ago. This is before dinosaurs, by the way. These creatures right here are an extinct type of non-mammalian therapsid. Here's what it looks like. And I mean, why would a human ever see these? They went extinct before dinosaurs, and dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. So what's going on? How in the world did a human see one of these things? That's obviously not true. How about a four-tusked elephant? They were roaming the earth 1.6 million years ago, but yet we have like the Ramayana or something talking about them guarding the entrance of a temple. They were alive. People saw them. Next one, hydroplate theory mentions Earth's core was liquefied. What evidence would we expect to find if this occurred? Well, the most important one of all really would be the evidence for the magnetic field reversals that we find rapidly occurring. If it did liquefy during that time, reversals would be extremely rapid. And that's exactly what we said happened in the flood, is that there was rapid. And when you look at the secular literature and you look at when these successions happen, they are in those layers that are considered deep evolutionary time, but that's when they're occurring mostly. And occurring outside of that, when they don't find them, they call them supercrons, which is ironic because it's just a rescue device. It's like, well, there are periods of time where there was no magnetic reversal seen for tens of millions of years. Okay, so they're supposed to occur. I mean, some people say as often as 10,000 years. Others say, 100,000 years. But that's pretty frequent. And then when they don't find them for millions of years, they just say, well, that was a supercron event. Oh, okay. Next one. Mammoths lived pre-flood and were frozen, and then the earth rolled 35 to 45%. How and why? Well, according to Walt Brown, when the fountains of the Great Deep broke forth, the water that came down froze the mammoths. And then once they got frozen in that area, the earth began to roll and rotate in a direction that placed them in the northern hemisphere, where they stayed frozen until we found them. We came across them. And this would be considered what's known as a quick freeze. Now, there's multiple things that can do this. Walt Brown chose one that is not on the list, the one I just explained, the cold, icy hail falling back down to Earth. But a comet impact could do that, or an asteroid airburst could do that, a hyper hurricane, or an Arctic superstorm, which would be like an ice age melt-off water running down and burying them and freezing them in place. The rapid glacial melt, the end of the ice age. So there's four things that could possibly have done that. But what about the shifting of the Earth 30 to 45%? What does that is because Earth's balance itself is like a gyroscope. If enough mass shifts on one side or builds up in one area, this could tilt the Earth 45 degrees. And well, what does Walt Brown's model say about that? Well, remember, he explains this by saying there was a rift that broke through and cracked as the crack of the mid-Atlantic ridge went around the Earth. It would fall down, and as it would fall down, it would burst, and then you would get the fountains of the Great Deep exploding out, and that weight shifting, now water coming out and filling up the Earth. This would obviously shift the weight of the Earth in different areas greatly. I mean, we're talking about a mid-Atlantic ridge in some areas that go up for miles. So massive shifts in weight. Remember, the continents are breaking apart and moving in different areas. That is why the tilt occurred. And that also explains what could freeze the mammoths. So we have the multiple things that could freeze them instantly. And we have two ways that can rotate and tilt the Earth to where its axis is today. Now, what about the requirement for making radioactive elements? The requirements are the depths, the pressure, the temperature of all of those things. So when you ask AI, does the criteria meet this for Walt Brown's theory, and you program in and you type those things in, you get the pressure between 1 to 3 GPa, you get a temperature of 400 degrees Celsius, you get a rock type, it needs quartz crystal rich with brittle rocks like granite, you need an electrical fields extremely high, possibly MV/M, we'll get to that in a minute, and we'll get to a neutron source, unknown or speculative, possibly piezonuclear reactions, and geological setting of subduction zones or deep faults or high shear crustal zones. 10 miles deep is what Walt Brown said this supercritical water was, and again, that depth would place it perfectly. It needed to be over 400. This lands between 450 and 600 degrees with a pressure of, remember what the minimum was, 1 GPa. We get the criteria, we match what we need. So how did they form? Again, this is the upper crust of the Earth, and we have the waters, the subterranean waters, or the fountains of the Great Deep, and then we have the continent coming down and compressing and smashing against that water, creating what's known as supercritical water, where it's extremely hot and steam-like. And there's an electrical force that comes from inside of these rocks, which, because they have quartz crystal, now creates electrical discharge known as the piezoelectric effect. And what that does is that massive amount of heat is being generated inside the water and from the electrodes and the debris that is melting the rocks around it, creating these radioactive elements. Then the fountains of the Great Deep break forth and rupture through, bringing these radioactive elements and sediments to the surface of the Earth to flood it and bring out limestone, Actually, lots of the sediments that we now find in the upper earth. And then again, when we go to the Proton 21 laboratories, we can find that they form these elements using a process that similar but not exactly the same. They use a machine that creates a Z-pinch, which is basically an extreme amount of energy. And then they use that forms plasma, and then they blast a piece of copper or metal to form these elements. So that would be very, very powerful, even more powerful than probably what would be required for the piezoelectric effect going on under the surface of the Earth. The next question would be, the hydroplate theory predicts granite rock can hold water, but where's their evidence for this? Again, we can go straight to the super deep borehole in Russia, I believe it is. And they predicted that when they get down there, they're just going to find lava and basalt. But Walt Brown said, no, basalt would be below the granite layer, way down, and even below the supercritical water that's down there. And what did we find? We found water in a still flowing manner locked inside of a granite rock. Exactly what Walt Brown predicted we would find and said would actually be down there. And that's where the fountains of the Great Deep, or even below this. So here we go. Around 7 miles deep, the scientists encountered fractured granite that contained water. And this was unexpected, of course, because this granite was thought to be too deep and too hot for the water to exist in a liquid form. The water wasn't from the surface. The discovery challenged previous assumptions and predictions about how deep water could be found in the Earth's crust and about the impermeability of granite. This mineralized water at the boundary where they expected that transition from granite to basalt. So pretty interesting. That's like perfectly in line with what Walt Brown was saying. And then, of course, years and years later, they found this. There's another one being dug right now in China, even deeper. Can't wait to see what they find. But what is the evidence that this subterranean water existed that's even deeper? Well, again, Walt Brown predicted that a long time ago, and they found it. An ocean beneath our feet. Scientists uncover a gigantic hidden sea miles below the Earth's crust, about 400 miles deep. That's really, really deep. So just so you know, this isn't like flowing water. This water is locked up in a mineral called ringwoodite, which comes from high amounts of pressure. And that pressure, right here we go. I don't know why they use pictures of liquid water, kind of confuses the audience to think like, oh, there's just a river down there. No, not really. The pressure's so great that it's locked it's not even in a liquid form anymore. It's compressed into rock. So that's where the deepest water is. So what about all the limestone we have on Earth today? Isn't most chalk made up of marine microfossils? Well, remember, before the flood, the oceans were shallow. Not all of them. I'm sorry, not the entire ocean. The entire ocean wasn't shallow. It's just a lot of it was more shallow, and it was producing limestone. That's pretty obvious. I mean, the highest mountains in catastrophic plate tectonics was about 4,000 to 5,000 feet. Walt Brown said around 6,000 to 9,000 feet. Either way, mountains were below 10,000 feet high. That's really, really low. So when we want to know about coral and chalk formation, we have to ask, like, what is the production amount of these things given today? How fast do they form? What do we see? Well, here we have those numbers, and the numbers are everything because we can make statements all day. We want to know, like, if Walt Brown is correct, then down below in the supercritical water, from the creation all the way to the flood, it was forming limestone that eventually got ejected out. But how much was made on the outside surface? I wanted to know because a lot of limestone that we do have is from coral, I think, anyway. So I've been told. Oh yeah, I wanted to know, like, would this amount of coral production forming calcium carbonate be harmful to the atmosphere itself? Or would it harm life over the 2,000 years of the production of 17 trillion metric tons of limestone? Remember, Walt Brown said this layer right here that you guys can see is in the water is what was forming most of the limestone that we have. And as it came out of the subterranean chambers deep below the earth, it was forming, and chemically, not biologically. And this chimeneas that we see forming in the what's known as the Lost City hydrothermal vents are right next to, get this, the mid-Atlantic ridge. So his came true again, that we can find it even today being formed underneath the oceans at these subterranean vents, and they make them and they flow straight up because they're ejected from with water and they're created chemically. And Walt Brown noticed that a geologist named William A. Tarr made the case that the limestone was created from inorganic origins of the chalks that we see in England and France. So that's fascinating. So visually, what it looks like is when the continent itself dropped down, the initial burst brought out massive amounts of sediments as it eroded away this area on the side. But underneath, the limestone that was made chemically over those 2,000 years precipitated out and then moved as a like dust chalk would, and before it solidified and made the limestone layers that we now see all over the earth. And to test this, John Mackay wanted to do a test and run it on limestone, and he did that very thing. So I'm going to show you guys a video now to show you what happens when he wanted to recreate a limestone layers inside of his flood machine.
When I first went to this area many, many years ago, I picked up from the Geological Association the guides to the area. You'll see the Bristol Channel there on the left. The unmarked area. You'll see the red line, which is the cross section we're going to look at, because in the textbook, it's actually allocated there. All right, now you see the big pink one that shows up at the spot. Then you've got all these other layers. The bricky ones are limestone. The sort of dotted ones are sandstone. And then you've got a section at the top. And the evolutionist explanation is this took millions of years. So there was my challenge. Okay, here is a section that my professor, based on what he said at the Grand Canyon, would have said, this has been formed sideways. But I have a sideways machine. We invented it. And by the time we get to testing this one, we're up to Mark 10 strata machine. Yes, research is expensive. We're now up to Mark 11 or 12 because a big storm smashed that one to pieces. Okay, so here we are, 2019, with the Mark 10 strata machine. Oh, you can see the sediment coming in with the flowing water at the right-hand side. You can see a layer there. Let's go closer up. Now, what's happening here? You can actually see the water flowing uphill on the right. You can see it flowing with level at the top, and you can see it bouncing along with curves. And actually, if you have a close-up look at that, can you see all the strata that's formed? Now, this is one current always flowing in the same direction. Look at this. One of the things we've observed, look at the right-hand side, just at the top. The layers there are not forming horizontally. They're actually forming parallel to the surface of the current. You know, I'm rewriting Steno's rules, that the law that says the layers form on the bottom first and they always form originally horizontally. I've decided that is nonsense. The layers in any deposit will form parallel to the surface of the current. I mean, look at the ones at the bottom. You see these nice curved ones? None of this sediment has been moved by uplift. This sediment has always been forming from right to left. And when it's been going topsy-turvy, it's formed current layers that are topsy-turvy. Nothing got moved around by any tectonic plate movement. Okay. Now, all that there, the sediment was coming in one. Oh, look, you can even see the top much clearer here. On the right-hand side, you will see the sediment is always forming parallel to that top of that wave. Quite amazing. In other words, you can say the anticlines and the synclines, these are the ones that go with geology or with the gravity or against it, uphill or downhill. None of them are due to subsidence or uplift. Now, the only thing we've done is actually vary the speed of the current, because that's what happens every day in a tide. And I sat in Washington State and watched a flood. Yep, I sat there for 3 days. I did go home for a bit of sleep, by the way, but I photographed the water coming down. There's no doubt about it. the flood would be vicious, and then it would slow down a bit. Then you'd have massive rain again, and you get bigger water coming in. So the speed of the current varied. Can you see what's happening? We are getting incredible deposits. And all of that, what looks like anticlines and synclines below it, is now got an opposite thing sitting on the top. And the water is still going in exactly the same direction. All that's changed is the speed of the current. Now, we are not taking millions of years to do this. We are not taking hundreds of years. It's undeniable. The beds are forming parallel. I mean, look at that. Flat at the top on the right-hand side. Then as it goes over the hill in the current, it's the current which is determining where the bed is, not the bed determining where the current is. All right, now let's go. There's the bottom. That's the cross-section out of the map guide from the Geological Association. What you've got at top is our section in the strata machine. The bottom one, according to the experts, took millions of years. Are you ready? Are you up to coping with the next bit? Have you taken your blood pressure pills on your heart tablets? Because the top section took 20 minutes. And all that happened, we didn't change the content of the sediment. We actually changed the speed just 2 or 3 times, because that's what we see in the real world. In bores like the Bristol Channel, when the tide comes in or out, in storms, even in tides with wave surges.
Pretty fascinating, right? The very thing that they were saying is that took such a long time to form, with limestone as well, formed very, very rapidly. Then, of course, take this into consideration, though. It's not solidified because it's still in the machine with water over it. Remove the water, how long would it take now for those to solidify and become the geologic layers that we now see? Still is not going to take millions of years. It's just not. So that's the key. But how can we also be sure? Because these, again, these are experimental, so we can witness and we can see it. But how would we know it on a grand scale? What would be a version that we can look to in the real world and say, like, okay, so if limestone flowed out and was moving almost like a liquid or a sediment and submerged in an area and filled it in, how would we know if that was true or if it was just a slow process? And I have that answer for you. And that answer is in trapping organisms that are still alive, that were living while encased in limestone. Couldn't have been hundreds of millions of years ago, like these geologic layers are dated. So what's going on? What in the world could possibly explain this other than Noah's flood? And I'm going to show you that right now.
I'm going to share a portion of a video with you that I think you're going to love. It was amazing to me, and I think you will find it just as amazing. I was told about this video by Bond, George Bond, and he was correct. This video by young Earth creationist Ian Juby is one of my favorites. So I took this portion or segment out of his longer video, which had many other topics in it, and I just extracted this clip. So I hope you guys enjoy, and don't forget to follow Ian on his channel called Wazaloo.
For the moment, I wish to focus on an article he wrote for the Creation Evidence Museum of Glen Rose, Texas in the 1990s, for which Dr. Carl Baugh has kindly given me permission to reproduce on my website. You can catch it here. You'll remember back to part 2 and 3 of this series, we discussed the Niagara Gorge. I pointed out that the hard limestone ledge at the top of the falls, which varies in thickness over the area, that limestone and shale layers, like just about all other sedimentary layers you find on planet Earth, are provincial in size. You can see the layer marked out on this North American map, where outcrops went east and west of Niagara Falls by 1,000 kilometers or more, outcropping all the way up into the Canadian high Arctic, thousands of kilometers away, and covering a good chunk of New York State. Now, this is where it gets important, because a lot of that rock was excavated during the construction of the Erie Canal over the years of 1793 through to 1825. The limestone and compacted gravels in this formation are assigned to the Silurian and Ordovician, and assigned an average age of 430 million evolutionary years old. Yet, as the workers excavated solid rock and compacted gravels, they routinely encountered toads entombed in solid rock. Not only were the toads not fossilized, not only were they preserved in remarkable condition, the toads were alive. The deep state of hibernation, called torpidity, keeps the toad in stasis as long as the toad is kept in temperatures below 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. The moment the toad warms up to that temperature, it cannot stay in this state of deep hibernation. Once the toads were freed from solid rock tombs, they warmed up and they would hop around in the presence of multiple eyewitnesses for a while, usually dying within the hour, but sometimes living for days. The American Journal of Science and Arts in 1822 documented the first case. The workmen engaged in blasting rock from the bed of the Erie Canal at Lockport in Niagara County lately discovered in a small cavity in the rock a toad in the torpid state, which on exposure to the air instantly came to life but died in a few moments afterwards. The cavity was only large enough to contain the body without allowing room for motion. To the surface was 6 inches through solid stone. Please notice that the cover of this issue, the article which contains the footnotes about the torpid toads found in solid rock, is an article of alleged fossil human footprints found in a rock on the shores of the Mississippi River at St. Louis. Rocks that today are assigned an age way before the time man was alleged to have evolved. We'll take a close look at the copious fossil human footprints found in the fossil record in the next lecture. To say that there was numerous reports like these living toads is an understatement. Another report from 1829 showed the skepticism from the scientists of the day. Scientists which became convinced upon further investigation of the reports. The discovery of toads in secondary rocks is often announced in public journals. A very particular account was published in the newspapers of one found at Lockport while they were cutting the canal bed in geodiferous lime rock. I collected all the facts in my power and examined the rock from which it was taken. The evidence would have been sufficient to establish any ordinary fact, but there seemed to be so many ways for illiterate laborers to deceive themselves that I took no further notice of the report. But I have since received an account of a large dark brown toad being found in a rock of millstone grit near Whitesboro, which I cannot hesitate to believe. While laying the cellar wall of Mr. Sill's house, the stonemasons had occasion to split a large stone from the quarry which I call the millstone grit. It was perfectly close-grained and compact. On opening it, they discovered a black or dark brown spherical mass about 3 inches in diameter in a cavity which it filled. On examining it particularly, they found it to be a toad, much larger than the common species and of a darker color. It was perfectly stupid, or in a stupor. It was laid upon a stone and soon began to give signs of life. In a few hours, it would hop moderately on being disturbed. They saw it in the yard moving about moderately for several days, but it was not watched by them any farther, and no one observed it farther movements. They laid one half of the stone in the wall so that the cavity may still be seen. The author goes on to rule out speculations of how a modern frog could have gotten into solid rock, and that this toad must be from before the time of Noah's flood. But frogs and toads found deep below the surface in impenetrable, undisturbed clays and compact gravels was quite common. In the 1831 issue of the American Journal of Science and Arts, they provide details and multiple eyewitness accounts of several of the probably dozens of reports. In answer to the inquiry respecting frogs and toads, I can only say generally that nothing was more common than to find very far from the surface of the earth these animals apparently in perfect health and vigor. They provide multiple eyewitness accounts of one such toad broken free from a cavity in solid limestone. The report that a living toad was found in limestone rock at Lockport in 1822 I well remember. On breaking into a cavity in the stone, a toad fell out and jumped several times. It soon died. Identical reports came out of England, where individual toads, including one turned white, and even small groups of toads were broken free from solid limestone, slate, and sandstones. The workers on the Erie Canal also found hundreds of clams still alive in the diluvial deposits, get this, 45 feet, 15 meters underground. Now, this was before the advent of Lyell's Deep Time and Darwin's heretical book. So the scientists of the day considered these to be ancient deposits from Noah's flood. As if intending to make a point, workers fried some of the clams and ate them. Notice what the author specifically states in his report. He was not questioning the claims of finding living animals buried deep underground. He wanted to settle in his heart that these deposits were in fact ancient, from the time of Noah's flood in his mind. I need not be prolix or wordy in the enumeration of facts of this kind, as similar cases are frequently recorded. My object is to present a case where the deposit is decidedly diluvial. Consequently, these animals must have lain from the time of the deluge, Noah's flood, for the earth in which they are found is too compact for them to be produced by a succession of generations. Therefore, the lives of these animals are greatly prolonged by exclusion from air and light, and their natural age is more than 3,000 years. Notice also that the author throws in a very valid dig against Darwin and his theory of evolution. It should be noted the author was referring to Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, as Charles had not even published his theories yet. Now, while this may surprise some, in a few lectures we're going to see that theories of evolution did not start with Charles, and in fact, the first theories were before the time of Christ. When we get to what would Jesus believe, we'll see why that is significant. These discoveries led to a series of rather cruel and unusual experiments with toads by multiple scientists trying to understand this torpidity. So many reports that I simply do not have the time to compile them here, but they will be listed in the references provided with this video. There were so many reports of living animals being found in solid rock that it wasn't a question of were these legitimate discoveries or was it actually happening, but rather the scientists were asking the question, how was it happening? And that was from scientists of the day who still believed these rocks were a mere 4,000 years old or so. Today, those rocks and deposits are considered Silurian and Ordovician, an average of 430 million evolutionary years old. These reports were publicized before Old Earth became vogue, which boosted the age of these deposits from 3,000 to 4,000 years old to an unprovable assigned age of 430 million years old. Judge for yourself. Which age has more credence and possibility? The examples of original biomatter still being found in fossils and even living organisms from allegedly ancient rocks are far too numerous to include in this lecture. Obviously, there is biological material there that can be carbon dated.
Boom. There we go. So I love that one because, I mean, come on, think about it. How old is the oldest frog in evolutionary terms? They evolved around 250 million years ago. Here they are almost double that age, found in solid rock, and then they get out and jump away. I mean, come on. It's so obvious. It's so obvious to anybody that really just wants to look at the evidence and see exactly what it's telling us. It's just screaming at us. But when you have a different presupposition in your mind, because this is all we learned in school, then we have to make sense of it evolutionarily, and we just have to drop a lot of logic and common sense to do it. The evidence is everywhere, and we can see it time and time again by just looking at the data. But a lot of problems that we have is that a lot of this old information like that is lost. It's gone. It's people forget. It's too bad, really. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. This was just supposed to be a quick video on answering some of the questions that were missed. We can do it again. I just wanted to do something for members while I have time, and I had time today. So until next time, hope everyone enjoyed. Take care.